The sheriff's lantern trembled in his hand. The thin glass quivered, with each gust of wind that crept through the cracks of the old cabin. Behind him, 12 armed deputies stood silent, their boots sinking into the muddy floor. The air smelled of rot and whiskey. They had been searching the Whitlock property since dawn, an endless sweep of rooms, barns and empty chicken coops. Nothing but silence, nothing but the weight of the fog pressing against the windows. Until one of the men, a deputy named Walsh, called out from the corner of the cabin, "Sheriff, you'll want to see this." Blackburn turned. The man was standing beside what looked like a patch of rotting straw and old planks near the back wall. Walsh had kicked some of the debris aside, revealing a dark outline, a seam in the floor that didn't belong. A trapdoor, the kind that wasn't meant to be found. For a moment, no one moved, only the sound of the wind outside whispering through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, the faint, hollow call of a crow. The sheriff knelt, brushed away the dirt, and felt the cold iron of a hidden latch. "Help me lift it," he said quietly. 2 men stepped forward. Together they heaved the trapdoor open. The hinges groaned. A cold breath of air rose from below, damp, metallic, and sour, like something long dead had been waiting to breathe again. The lantern light fell into the darkness. What it revealed made every man in that cabin take an involuntary step back. Below them yawned a hollow, an earthen cavity carved into the mountain rock. Inside, the pale glint of metal buckles, torn fabric, and the shapes of boots, stacked neatly against one another. Saddlebags, clothes, a folded woman's dress, and then more. A Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded. A name pressed in gold letters still visible beneath the grime. Reverend Isaiah Morton. The sheriff's heart pounded. He remembered the missing preacher gone without a trace 3 months ago. He descended the ladder first, the wood creaking under his weight. The beam of his lantern danced across the cold stone walls, revealing marks scratched deep into the surface, symbols, rough, circular, carved with obsessive precision. They looked old, far older than the cabin itself. Walsh followed, rifle in hand, his breath trembling. What is this place?" The sheriff didn't answer. He crouched to inspect a pile of belongings. Men's boots, a doctor's bag, a length of blue calico cloth, even a small child's wooden toy. Dozens of items, each one clean, organized, as if placed there carefully. But there were no bodies. That was the worst part. All this evidence of life, and not a single trace of what had happened to the people who owned them. Then came the smell. It drifted up slowly, sickly sweet and unmistakable. Decay. But not from flesh, not anymore. It was older, buried deep into the earth. The sheriff turned toward the far end of the chamber, where the rock wall curved downward into darkness. There was a sound, soft, rhythmic, like singing. At first, he thought it was the wind through the cracks above. But as the men froze, the sound grew clearer, a low, lilting hum that rose and fell in perfect harmony. 3 voices perfectly matched, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Walsh's face went white. "Sheriff, they're still here." But when the men climbed out, the room above was empty. Jonathan Whitlock sat dead at his table, eyes open, bottle beside him. His daughters, Martha, Clara, and June, were kneeling on the wooden floor, holding hands, swaying gently back and forth. Their eyes were closed. Their lips were moving. The same melody, the same song. The sheriff stood there frozen, watching them as the sound wound its way up through the cabin, into the fog outside and out across the dark valley. A sound that would, for generations, make the locals whisper when they spoke of this mountain. A song that marked the beginning of the story America tried to forget. 8 months earlier, before the cabin became a name spoken only in hushed tones, before the newspapers called them the Devil's Triplets of Appalachia, the Whitlocks were just another family surviving the ruins of a country that had lost its soul. The year was 1873. The United States was still bleeding. From the Civil War, 8 years after its end, the South remained a fractured shadow of itself. Whole towns lay in ruin, their people scattered, their faith in God replaced by suspicion and superstition. And in the high Appalachian ridges that cut through West Virginia and Kentucky, the law was an idea more than a presence. Men drank, fought, vanished, and were buried without a word said to the county. In those fog-choked valleys, whispers traveled faster than wagons. One of those whispers began in a small clearing near Pike County, where an old cabin stood, its chimney cracked, its fields untended, its walls scarred by time. The Whitlock cabin. Jonathan Whitlock, a veteran of the Confederate Army, lived there with his 3 daughters. They were triplets, Martha, Clara, and June, born the same night their mother, Sarah, died giving them life. The women of the mountains said Sarah's last words were not prayers, but warnings. And for 21 years, those girls grew up wild. They learned to trap animals and skin them before they learned to read. They hunted in silence, moved through the woods barefoot, and spoke only when necessary. Some said they could mimic the call of a bobcat so perfectly that hunters swore the animals themselves fled from it. Others said that when you looked at them, really looked, you couldn't tell which one was which. That winter, snow came early to Pike County. Roads turned to ice. Travel halted. And in the midst of that isolation, a man named Elias Turner, a traveling merchant, disappeared. He was last seen heading toward the Whitlock property. Elias Turner was the kind of man everyone trusted. He was no outlaw, no wanderer, a husband, a father of 4, and a merchant who had spent a decade riding the same Appalachian trails, selling cloth, tools, and medicine to families hidden deep in the woods. He knew every slope and stream, every hollow where the fog liked to linger. So when his horse returned to Prestonburg without him, reins torn and saddlebags missing, people knew something terrible had happened. At first they thought he'd slipped from a ridge, maybe frozen in the snow or been taken by wolves. But the tracks stopped, cleanly, halfway along the Whitlock Trail. The snow was untouched beyond that point. Like the world itself had decided his journey ended there. His wife, Mary, waited 7 days before reporting him missing. The sheriff, Thomas Blackburn, organized a search party. 20 men armed with lanterns and shovels. They combed the woods for days. Nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Only a single glove near the creek, stiff with frost, and the echo of crows above the trees. It was Blackburn's first encounter with the Whitlock name. He'd heard of them, of course. Everyone had. Jonathan Whitlock, the one-armed veteran, a man who came back from war with more scars in his mind than on his body. People said he'd been seen arguing with shadows after dark. Some swore they'd heard the triplets singing long after midnight. Strange harmonies that didn't sound like church songs. Still, the sheriff was a man of reason. He rode out one morning through sleet and mud to the Whitlock property. When he arrived, Jonathan was standing on the porch with a bottle in his hand. His face was wind-burned, his eyes bleary. The 3 girls stood behind him, motionless, identical, their long black hair hanging loose and tangled. "We're looking for a merchant," Blackburn said, dismounting. "Passed through here last week. Name of Elias Turner." Jonathan spat over the railing. "Ain't seen no merchant," he said. "Ain't seen nobody." Behind him, the girls stared. The sheriff felt their gaze like a cold hand on his neck. He tried not to look too long, but their eyes, dark, unblinking, didn't move. "Not once. You mind if I take a look around the property?" Jonathan laughed, a bitter sound. "Without a warrant? You're a long way from the law out here, Sheriff." He was right. In 1873, mountain folk lived by their own rules. Federal authority meant little, especially to those still resentful after the war. Blackburn left that day uneasy. He made a note in his logbook. Whitlock family unsuspicious. Recommend further observation. He didn't know it yet, but that note would mark the beginning of a nightmare. 2 weeks later, another man disappeared. This time, a preacher, Reverend Isaiah Morton, had been traveling through the mountains spreading scripture to remote cabins. He was 60 years old, gentle, and frail. His last known destination, Pike County, the Whitlock Trail. By now, panic had begun to take hold. The papers in Lexington ran headlines about the vanishing men of the ice Appalachians. Rumors spread that raiders were ambushing travelers, or worse, that something ancient in the mountains was claiming them. Sheriff Blackburn returned to the Whitlock property, this time with a warrant. Rain was falling hard when they reached the cabin. The place looked smaller now, swallowed by fog and vines. Jonathan Whitlock met them at the door, drunk again, shouting about persecution. But the law was on Blackburn's side. "Step aside," he ordered. They searched everything, the cabin, the barn, even the shallow well behind the house. They turned over straw, prodded the dirt, lifted every plank. Nothing. No preacher, no merchant. Not even a trace of disturbed earth. But there was something else. The smell. That same faint metallic odor the sheriff couldn't name. When he walked past the sisters, he noticed it was stronger near them. They stood on the porch the entire time, barefoot in the rain, watching the men with perfect stillness. When one tilted her head, the others did too. As he rode back down the trail that night, Blackburn wrote a single line in his notebook. "There is something wrong with the Whitlock girls." He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. By midsummer, the mountain had claimed 5 more. A young fur trapper, a traveling doctor, and a runaway woman trying to cross the ridge. Into Tennessee, all vanished on the same routes. Each time, the last sighting placed them near the Whitlock property. Now even the locals stopped walking the old trails. Farmers nailed crosses to trees. Hunters refused to enter the northern woods. People began calling it the Hollow of Death. Sheriff Blackburn's office filled with letters demanding action. Some wanted arrests, others wanted the entire mountain burned. He knew what he had to do. On the first week of August, he assembled a team of 12 armed men. They camped in the forest near the Whitlock property, concealed behind ridge lines and streams. Their orders were simple: watch, listen, and report anyone entering or leaving the cabin. For 2 weeks, they saw nothing unusual. Jonathan went down to Pikeville twice, always returning drunk. The girls hunted rabbits and fetched water. Always together, always silent. Until one afternoon when a man on horseback appeared. He was well-dressed, middle-aged, riding a bay horse with saddlebags full of tools and supplies. He stopped at the creek to drink, then continued up the trail toward the Whitlocks. The watchers couldn't warn him. Doing so would expose their position. They could only watch as the man rode up the path and vanished behind the trees. 2 hours later, the horse came back down the trail alone. Its saddle was empty. The reins were torn. The animal's flanks were foamed with sweat, its eyes rolling wildly. That was all the proof Sheriff Blackburn needed. He gathered his men, and as the sun began to bleed red over the mountains, they rode toward the Whitlock cabin, unaware that what they'd find would scar Pike County forever. By the time the sheriff's men reached the Whitlock property, the sun had dropped behind the ridges, leaving the sky the color of cooling embers. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds, no crickets, not even the wind moving through the pines. The cabin stood there in the half-light like a shadow carved out of wood. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, but no sound came from within. Blackburn raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. "Stay sharp," he whispered. "No mistakes." They approached slowly, boots crunching over wet soil. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed, thick, almost electric, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The sheriff stepped onto the porch and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. "Jonathan Whitlock! This is Sheriff Blackburn of Pike County. Open the door." Silence. A deputy stepped forward and shoved the door with his shoulder. It swung open easily, too easily. Inside, the lantern light revealed a scene frozen in eerie calm. Jonathan Whitlock sat at the table, head bowed slightly, a half-finished bottle of whiskey by his arm. His eyes were open, clouded, and lifeless. "Dear God," one of the deputies muttered. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. He was simply gone. The sheriff stepped closer, fingers brushing the man's wrist, cold as stone. "He's been dead for hours," Blackburn said quietly. "Maybe a day." And then one of the men gasped. "Sheriff." They turned toward the adjoining room. The 3 sisters were sitting on the wooden floor, forming a perfect circle. They were holding hands, swaying gently back and forth, humming in unison. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the same melody the sheriff would later hear echoing in his nightmares for the rest of his life. It wasn't a hymn. It wasn't any church song he'd ever known. It had rhythm, structure, but it felt wrong. The tones clashed and pulsed, as if the very sound bent the air around them. "Martha," the sheriff called, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" None of them looked up. The deputies exchanged nervous glances. One reached out to touch June's shoulder, and the singing stopped. All 3 turned their heads at the same time, perfectly synchronized. Their eyes were black. Not just dark, black. Pupils stretched so wide that no color remained. And then one of them smiled. It wasn't a smile of fear or madness. It was slow, deliberate, and knowing. "Get them restrained," Blackburn said, forcing steadiness into his voice. Chains clinked. The deputies cuffed the sisters one by one. Even as they did, the girls continued to move in eerie unison, turning their heads, blinking, breathing together. No one spoke for a long moment. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, rising from beneath the floorboard like rust and rot, soaked into the very earth. The sheriff followed it to the back corner, where a pile of old straw and wood sat half-rotted. He kicked it aside, and the edge of a plank shifted beneath his boot. "Here," he said. "Help me." Two men joined him. Together, they lifted the planks, revealing a trap door hidden beneath. The hinges screeched as it opened, releasing a gust of cold air that seemed to crawl up from the mountain's gut. They lowered a lantern. The light flickered across something metallic, something soft, something stacked in unnatural order. The men descended. Below was a natural stone hollow, neither cave nor cellar, but something in between. The walls were covered in markings, carved deep into the rock, spirals, lines, symbols that no man there recognized. And within that hollow lay the proof of everything the sheriff had feared. Dozens of personal items, a doctor's satchel, a woman's shawl, a pair of boots too fine for mountain life, the cracked spectacles of a preacher, each belonging placed carefully, almost reverently. But no bodies. The sheriff's pulse hammered in his ears. He turned, raising the lantern to the wall. There, carved into the rock itself, were words, faint and crude as though etched by fingernails. "The mountain takes what's owed." The sheriff felt the air tighten around him. He could hear the low hum again, that sound that wasn't wind, wasn't animal. It came from deeper within the rock, vibrating through the floor. He turned toward the ladder. "Out," he ordered. "Everyone out!" The deputies scrambled up, their boots thudding against the boards. Blackburn followed, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him. When he looked around, he saw the sisters sitting just as before, chained now, but still swaying, still humming that same rhythm under their breath. He felt something cold run down his spine. Even as he left the cabin, even as the night swallowed the valley, he could still hear it. The faint echo of three voices merging into one, carried by the wind over the peaks. That night, Pikeville slept uneasy. The sheriff's men whispered about what they had seen, but none could put words to it. By dawn, Blackburn had already sent riders to fetch the county judge and a doctor. The law demanded answers, but deep down, he suspected none would come. Because some things in those mountains didn't belong to law or reason. They belonged to the mountain. And once the mountain took notice, it never forgot. The morning after the discovery at the Whitlock cabin, a heavy fog rolled through Pike County. It hung low over the courthouse, swallowing the roof lines of the old brick buildings and muting every sound. It was as though the mountain itself had descended to listen. Inside the sheriff's office, Thomas Blackburn sat alone at his desk, the journal from the night before open in front of him. The lamplight flickered across his handwriting, uneven, smudged. The words crowded as though he'd been racing against his own thoughts. Evidence recovered from Whitlock property, numerous belongings of missing persons. No bodies, subjects detained, 3 females. Behavior abnormal, repeating melody, all movements synchronized. Possible mass psychosis, or something else. He paused, staring at the last 2 words. Something else. He closed the notebook with a sigh. The air in the room felt heavier than the smoke curling from his pipe. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those girls again, the way they moved, the way they didn't blink. And that song, he could still hear it. By noon, the sisters had been transported to the small Pikeville jail, a stone building at the edge of town with 4 narrow cells and a single barred window in each. The sheriff had ordered them separated, hoping to break whatever strange unity they shared. It didn't work. Even in separate cells, they stood in the same position, facing the wall, hands clasped loosely in front of them. When one shifted, the others did too. When one sighed, the others exhaled seconds later, as though following an unseen rhythm. The deputies refused to go near them unless absolutely necessary. "Sir," one of them said, "I swear they don't sleep. Sat there all night, eyes wide open. Didn't move a muscle. I checked on them every hour. Felt like they were watching me even when they weren't." Blackburn didn't respond. He only lit another match and stared through the iron bars at the triplets. Their faces were pale and identical, their expressions unreadable. It was impossible not to wonder what had shaped them. What kind of childhood bred such stillness? By afternoon, the county judge arrived, followed by a small crowd of townspeople who gathered outside, demanding answers. Word had already spread about the trapdoor. The strange carvings, the smell of death. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some claimed the Whitlock sisters were witches. Others said they were possessed, born under a curse that had taken their mother's life. A few whispered that the civil war had left the land itself haunted and that the mountains hungered for human souls, and the girls were merely its servants. The judge dismissed most of it as hysteria. He ordered a formal statement from the sheriff and appointed a doctor to examine the prisoners. Dr. Albert Brennan arrived that evening, a quiet, gray-haired man with wire spectacles and a reputation for patience. He entered each cell in turn, asking questions, observing reactions. He received none. "They're conscious," Brennan said afterward, cleaning his hands with a cloth, "but their minds seem elsewhere. No signs of fever, poisoning, or physical trauma. Pupils dilated, pulse irregular. I can't explain the synchronization. It's as if they share a single nervous system." Blackburn frowned. "You think they're faking it?" The doctor shook his head. "No, I think they genuinely believe or know something that we don't." Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. As night fell, the crowd dispersed reluctantly. The jail grew quiet, except for the drip of rain against the roof. The sheriff stayed behind with 2 deputies, keeping watch. Sometime past midnight, a low murmur rose from the cells. At first it sounded like whispering, faint and uneven, like wind moving through a cave. Then the rhythm returned. That same melody. It filled the corridor, soft but clear, vibrating through the stone walls. The sheriff stood. "Enough of that!" he barked, slamming the butt of his rifle against the bars. The singing stopped, but when he turned to leave, a voice, 3 voices, spoke together, perfectly aligned. He saw the hollow. He cannot unsee it. Blackburn froze. "Who said that?" No reply. The sisters stood silent once again, their eyes fixed on the far wall. The sheriff felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He forced himself to turn away, forcing logic into his mind. It's shock, he told himself, hysteria, that's all. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The next morning, the county coroner completed his report on the remains found at the Whitlock property. His conclusion was grim. Fragments of human bone recovered from multiple fire pits behind the Whitlock barn. Small in size, evidence of long-term exposure to intense heat. Consistent with human cremation. Estimated minimum 8 individuals. The news spread through Pikeville like wildfire. Church bells rang. Mothers locked their doors. Men gathered in groups, rifles on their shoulders, muttering about justice. And by sunset, Pikeville had a new name for the Whitlock property. They called it the Hollow of Death. The following days brought an unease that no sermon or sunlight could erase. Pikeville had seen violence before. The war had taken husbands, fathers, sons, but this was different. The fear wasn't of men. It was of something older, something that didn't obey the same rules. Even the weather seemed to share the town's dread. A cold mist clung to the streets for days, heavy as breath on glass. Chickens refused to leave their coops. Dogs howled at empty fields. And at night, people swore they heard faint singing echoing from the northern hills. 3 voices, always in harmony, always the same tune. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Blackburn sat through long interrogations. The triplets had been formally charged with the murders of 11 people, the merchant, the preacher, the doctor, the runaway woman, and others whose names were whispered with pity but never confirmed. The sheriff didn't like it. Yes, the evidence was there, the belongings, the burned bones, but there were no witnesses, no bodies, and nothing that explained the girls themselves. He had seen killers before. He had seen madness, too. This was neither. When they were brought before the judge, the sisters didn't fight, didn't cry, didn't even look afraid. They walked side by side, chained together, their steps falling in the same rhythm, like 3 reflections of one mind. The judge asked for their plea. They said nothing. He repeated the question. Still nothing. Finally, when the silence became unbearable, the middle sister, Clara, according to the sheriff's identification, tilted her head and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "The mountain remembers." And that was all. The trial began the following week. Every seat in the courthouse was filled. Outside, hundreds gathered in the streets, praying, gossiping, or glaring toward the jailhouse where the sisters were kept under constant watch. The prosecutor, Nathaniel Pierce, presented the evidence methodically. The trap door, the belongings, the bone fragments, the diary of Sarah Whitlock discovered under a loose floorboard. He read from it aloud in the courtroom, his voice echoing off the walls. "They come to me in dreams," Sarah had written. "Three shadows whispering from the cave. They speak in a tongue I do not know, but I understand. They want what I carry. I begged the Lord for mercy, but he is silent. The mountain calls for its children." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The defense objected, claiming the diary was hearsay, the ramblings of a woman dying in childbirth. But even as he spoke, the defense attorney couldn't keep his voice steady, because everyone in that room felt the same thing. A pressure, a weight, as if the air itself was listening. The doctor took the stand next. He described the cavity beneath the Whitlock cabin, the unnatural carvings and the absence of human remains. "I've seen death before," he said, "but never anything like that." Whoever or whatever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Every trace of flesh was gone. "Burned clean." He paused, glancing at the sisters seated silently across the room. "They didn't just kill. They performed something." The word something lingered in the air long after he left the stand. When the psychiatrist, Dr. Heinrich Müller, was called, the room fell silent. He was a German immigrant, one of the few men in the region with formal medical training from Europe. He had spent 3 days observing the sisters through their cell bars. His report was unsettling. They respond to each other's movements with no visible cue. When one eats, the others begin moments later. When one turns her head, the rest follow precisely. It is beyond imitation. It suggests a neurological connection, or perhaps something else entirely. "Do you believe them to be sane?" the prosecutor asked. Muller hesitated. "In the medical sense, no. In the human sense?" He looked toward the sisters. "I am not certain they are human in the way we understand it." A collective shiver passed through the audience. The sisters remained unmoved, still silent, watching nothing and everything at once. The trial stretched for days. Each new testimony deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The preacher's Bible, the merchant's tools, the strange symbols on the walls of the cabin, the burned bones. No one could prove the girl's guilt beyond the evidence of horror itself. And yet everyone in that courtroom already knew the verdict. They had decided the moment the sisters walked in. On the third day, as the jury sat frozen in tense silence, one of the triplets, Martha, the eldest by minutes, finally turned her head. Her gaze fell upon the 12 jurors, one by one, slowly. When her eyes met theirs, each man flinched, as if struck by a sudden chill. Later, they would describe the experience the same way. It felt like she was seeing through them, not looking at them, through them, as if she knew their hidden sins, as if she could name them all. And when her gaze reached the judge's bench, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but no one who saw it would ever forget it. Then for the first time since her arrest, Martha spoke. "You can't kill the mountain." Her voice was soft, almost kind. But every man in that room would later swear that the sound of those 6 words echoed long after she stopped speaking. Silence followed those 6 words. Even the air seemed to hold still, as if afraid to move. The judge's gavel struck the table once, twice, 3 times before the murmur of voices dared return to the room. The triplets did not speak again. They sat in that same eerie stillness, their gazes fixed on some invisible point beyond the far wall. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the first chill of an early autumn. For the rest of the trial, the sisters' composure never faltered. Witnesses wept. Jurors avoided their eyes. And through it all, they remained motionless. 3 pale figures that seemed carved from the same stone that birthed the mountain itself. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. 11 counts of murder. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week. There was no debate about punishment. In 1873, Kentucky law was clear. The penalty for murder was death by hanging. The execution was set for October 23rd. When the news spread, Pikeville erupted. For days, men and women poured in from neighboring counties to witness the spectacle. Merchants set up tents. Children whispered ghost stories by firelight. Some came for justice, others came for revenge, and some came simply because they wanted to see if the mountain would strike back. Sheriff Blackburn watched it all from the jailhouse window. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The nightmares had started. The night he'd arrested the girls, dreams of the hollow, the carvings, and that humming sound coming from the dark. Sometimes he'd wake to find the melody still echoing faintly in his ears, even though the sisters' cells were silent. Now, as the fog thickened outside and the gallows creaked in the courtyard, he couldn't shake the feeling that Pikeville was standing on the edge of something far bigger than 3 condemned women. The night before the execution, the sheriff increased the guard. 6 men patrolled the halls, rifles in hand. The jail was silent except for the occasional crackle of the fire in the stove. Then, just after midnight, one of the guards, Peter Sullivan, reported hearing something. It was faint at first, coming from deep within the walls, a low murmur, rhythmic and cold. He pressed his ear against the stone and froze. There were voices, dozens of them. They weren't speaking English. The sounds were guttural, old, like a language that belonged to the mountain more than to men. He ran to fetch the sheriff. By the time Blackburn arrived, every guard had heard it. The voices, the chanting, and beneath it, a vibration that made the lamps flicker. It lasted for nearly an hour. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. When Blackburn entered the corridor, the triplets were standing in their cells, motionless, facing the walls. But there was something new. Symbols, intricate spirals and shapes, had been scratched deep into the stone, carved clean through the mortar. The marks were dark, almost as if burned into the rock. No one had heard them move. No tools had been given. And yet the carvings were there, precise and deliberate. The sheriff reached out to touch one, then pulled his hand back instantly. The stone was ice cold. He called for water and ordered the walls scrubbed clean. The men tried. The symbols would not fade. Morning came gray and heavy. The crowd outside had swelled into the hundreds, maybe more. Some had been drinking since dawn. Others prayed aloud, their voices rising with the fog. The gallows had been built in the courtyard behind the jail. 3 ropes, perfectly measured, swinging slightly in the breeze. Blackburn led the procession himself. The triplets walked in chains, calm and silent, their feet bare on the wet ground. Their faces betrayed no fear, no remorse. When the priest stepped forward to offer them final prayers, none of them looked at him. When he asked if they had last words, they spoke together, in perfect unison. The mountain remembers. The mountain awaits. The mountain always returns. The words rippled through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. The judge gave a signal. The executioner, a man from a neighboring county, paid extra for his services, pulled the lever. The 3 sisters dropped at once. The ropes went taut with a sound like snapping timber. For a moment there was silence. Then came the gasps, not of grief, but disbelief. The sisters were still moving. Their bodies writhed, legs kicking, arms twitching, not randomly, but together, in rhythm, as though they were still singing, though no sound escaped their lips. When one's foot jerked, the other 2 mirrored it. When one's hand clenched, so did the others. It lasted longer than anyone dared count. Some said a minute. Others swore it was closer to 3. Then at last they went still. The doctor stepped forward, checked each pulse, and nodded to confirm. Dead. But the air did not feel relieved. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a low rumble from the mountains. Not thunder. Not storm, but something deep and resonant, as if the earth itself had groaned. People began to back away. Dogs howled. And when the first roll of true thunder finally did break the silence, the crowd scattered like frightened birds. Within an hour, Pikeville was empty of celebration. Only rain and fear remained. The sisters were buried that afternoon. 3 plain coffins in the far corner of the cemetery, away from the consecrated ground. No marker, no prayer. Just dirt and the whisper of wind through the grass. But the mountain was not done with Pikeville. Not yet. The rain did not stop for 3 days after the execution. It fell in sheets, flooding the narrow roads, drowning the riverbanks. and turning Pikeville into a ghost town of soaked wood and trembling lanterns. By the fourth day, when the storm finally passed, the air still smelled of wet earth and smoke. The sky was pale and empty, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. And then the dreams began. Sheriff Blackburn was the first to feel it. The night after the burials, he woke in his bed gasping, sweat clinging to his neck despite the cold. The dream was always the same. 3 silhouettes standing on the ridge of the mountains, faces hidden by shadow, their long hair moving in a wind he could not feel. They were singing. Not loud, not soft, just steady. That same melody. Each time he tried to call out. Each time he woke up with the sound still echoing faintly in the corners of the room. At first he told no one. He had lived through war, through blood and chaos. Dreams were nothing new. But soon he learned he wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, a dozen people in town reported the same nightmare, the same song. Even the judge. Judge Hammond's hands had begun to shake uncontrollably. His clerk noticed it first. The tremor that ran through his fingers each time he picked up the gavel. At night, the judge told his wife he heard whispers in his study, voices murmuring from the dark corners of the room. They never said words he could understand, but he could feel the tone. Mockery, laughter, and the same refrain repeating beneath it all. The mountain remembers. The jurors didn't fare much better. Jacob Miller, a stout farmer with iron nerves, was found one morning kneeling in his field, staring at a dozen of his dead cows. There were no wounds, no signs of disease. They had simply fallen where they stood. That night, he told his wife he saw 3 women standing by the tree line at dusk, all identical, all silent. He went to bed with his rifle beside him. By morning, he was gone. His footprints led toward the forest and ended there. The town preacher called for prayer gatherings. He told the townsfolk that evil had been purged from the earth, that the sisters' souls were gone, and that the mountain's shadow had been lifted. But no one believed him, because at night the dogs still howled, and sometimes from far off in the hills, people swore they heard music. 6 months passed before the next disappearance. A young trapper named Daniel Hayes left home one morning to check his lines in the high valley. He never came back. The sheriff organized a search. Dozens of men combed the slopes for days. They found his pack, his traps, his hat, but not him. The only clue was carved into the trunk of a tree near the last known spot. 3 spirals interlocked in a triangle, the same symbol that had been found in the Whitlock cabin. When the sheriff saw it, his heart went cold. The trees seemed to sway even though there was no wind. He ordered the men to leave. The dreams intensified. Now the voices in Blackburn's sleep spoke to him directly. He saw the 3 sisters again, standing in the mist, their hands clasped together. Their eyes were open, black and endless, and when they smiled, he felt his knees weaken. "You can't kill the mountain," they whispered. "You only feed it." He woke screaming. His wife begged him to leave Pikeville, to take their children and move to Lexington, but the sheriff refused. He said duty kept him there. In truth, it wasn't duty. It was fear. Not of what he'd seen, but of what would follow if he ran. Because something in his gut told him the mountain would come for him either way. By spring of 1874, rumors spread of strange lights near the old Whitlock property, blue and green glows moving through the trees, forming circles before vanishing into the mist. Some said it was marsh gas. Others said it was souls. Blackburn didn't want to go back, but he had no choice. He gathered 15 men, deputies, hunters, and a preacher, and set out toward the hollow once again. The climb was harder this time. The forest had thickened. Branches twisted and swollen as if the trees themselves were trying to block the way. The trail that once led to the Whitlock cabin was gone, swallowed by roots and moss. When they finally reached the clearing, the sheriff stopped dead. The cabin, the one they had burned to the ground, was still there. Not rebuilt, not intact, but there. Charred beams stood half upright. The stone foundation had cracked open. The smell of ash lingered even though months had passed. And the air was wrong. Too still, too heavy. Even the birds refused to sing. "Spread out," Blackburn ordered, though his voice trembled. "Stay in sight of each other. No one goes alone." The men obeyed, fanning out through the clearing, rifles raised. Then from somewhere deep within the ruin came a sound, a faint hum, steady and low. One of the younger men, William Carter, laughed nervously. "Probably whined through the stones," he said, stepping closer. He brushed his hand along the remains of a wall and screamed. The skin on his palm blistered instantly. The wood, though cold, had seared him as though red hot. When he pulled his hand away, the sheriff saw it, burned into the skin, faint but clear. 3 spirals interlocked. The mark of the hollow. The humming grew louder. Somewhere beneath the ground, the earth began to pulse. Slow, rhythmic, alive. "Back!" the sheriff shouted. "Everyone back!" But before they could retreat, the trapdoor shifted, the same one they had sealed months ago, and from the darkness below came a single, whispering breath, 3 voices speaking as one. "Welcome back, Sheriff." The mountain had woken. The men froze where they stood. Lanterns flickered as the sound crawled up from beneath the trapdoor. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice. It was something in between, something that knew them. Sheriff Blackburn felt his throat go dry. He'd heard that voice before, in his dreams, in the silence between thunderclaps, in the black eyes of those 3 sisters as the rope snapped tight. It was them. It was always them. He raised his lantern and stepped closer. The light trembled across the planks that sealed the trapdoor. They were cracked, warped by moisture, but the nails were still in place. The ground beneath it pulsed again, slow, measured, like a heartbeat. "Sheriff," one of the men whispered. "Let's go. This ain't right." Blackburn wanted to agree. Every nerve in his body screamed to turn and run. But something deeper, pride, duty, maybe madness, kept his boots rooted to the earth. He motioned for the men to hold their ground. "We seal it again," he said. "Then we burn everything left." No one argued. They began gathering stones and timber, throwing them over the trap door, piling it high. The hum beneath them grew louder, the air thicker. The forest itself seemed to lean in, the trees bending ever so slightly toward the hollow, as though they were listening. Then came the first scream. One of the men, Carter, the young deputy with the burned hand, dropped his lantern. His eyes rolled back and he fell to his knees, clutching his head. "Get him up!" Blackburn shouted, rushing forward. But Carter was already convulsing, foam gathering at his lips. When they turned him over, his pupils were gone, replaced by solid black. And when he spoke, the voice that came out wasn't his. "You can't bury what was never dead." The other men staggered back. One of them crossed himself. Another whispered a prayer. Blackburn aimed his revolver at Carter. "Whatever you are, stop talking." The boy's mouth curled into a crooked grin. "We waited, Sheriff, just like you asked." Then his body went still. For a moment there was silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums. Then the hum returned, rising into a low wail that shook the ground. The stones they had piled began to vibrate, toppling one by one. Something was moving under there. "Out!" the sheriff barked. "Everyone out!" The men didn't need to be told twice. They ran, stumbling through the wet soil, crashing through brush. Blackburn was the last to leave, turning just once to see the clearing, bathed in an eerie green, light seeping from the cracks. Between the planks, the trapdoor lifted, slow and deliberate, though nothing visible touched it. He turned and fled into the trees. They didn't stop running until the mountain began to slope downward, and the forest thinned. There, by the edge of the creek, they collapsed, gasping for air. Only 11 men remained. "What about Carter?" one of them asked between breaths. Blackburn didn't answer. He looked back toward the ridge, toward the faint glow still pulsing in the distance. "We're not going back," he said. "Not tonight." "Not ever." The others nodded, some muttering prayers, others just staring at the ground, but no one noticed the reflection. In the water beside them, 3 faint silhouettes, standing in the current, their outlines barely visible beneath the moonlight. Watching, when the group finally returned to Pikeville, their clothes torn and faces pale, the townsfolk gathered to listen. What they told them was simple. The hollow was cursed, and no one should ever go there again. That night, the sheriff filed his final report. He wrote only one sentence. The mountain took back what belonged to it. Then he packed his badge in a drawer and walked home in silence. For weeks afterward, the town lived in uneasy quiet. No one dared go near the hollow. Even hunters avoided the northern trails. But peace never truly returned. Crops began to rot from the roots. Wells ran black with silt. Livestock died without wound or reason. And those who dreamed of the same thing. 3 women, standing in the fog, smiling. Some swore they could hear their names whispered softly at night. Others said they saw faint lights drifting between the trees, moving in slow circles, humming as they went. By winter, Pikeville had lost a quarter of its population. Families packed wagons and left before the snow came, saying they'd rather face hunger elsewhere than live under a mountain that watched them sleep. Sheriff Blackburn stayed. He couldn't leave. Not after what he'd seen. But he stopped patrolling, stopped attending church. He just sat on his porch each night, staring north toward the dark ridges, waiting for the humming to start again. And one night, it did. It began as a vibration underfoot like a distant storm. Then the sound rose, low and haunting, moving closer with every heartbeat. He stood, revolver in hand, though he knew a bullet would mean nothing. The wind shifted, and in the yard beyond the gate he saw them. 3 figures standing shoulder to shoulder, barefoot, hair matted with rain, eyes black as coal. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just smiled. And then, as lightning split the sky behind them, they vanished, leaving only the sound of their song carried by the wind. The next morning, when the deputy came to check on him, the sheriff's chair was empty. His gun was on the porch rail, rusted with dew. The only thing left was his notebook open on the table. Inside, written in shaky, fading ink, were his final words. "The mountain remembers. And it's still hungry." The sheriff's disappearance sent a wave of dread through Pikeville. No one wanted to say it aloud, but everyone already knew what it meant. The mountain had claimed him. They searched, of course. Dozens of men combed the woods, rifles slung over their shoulders, dogs sniffing the damp earth. But the trail ended the same way all the others did, at the edge of the forest, where the ground turned black and soft. One of the hounds refused to move past it. The animal whined, tail tucked, and clawed backward until its handler let go of the leash. Beyond that line, the trees grew wrong, trunks warped, branches twisting like bones beneath stretched skin. Even the birds didn't fly there. The men turned back. They didn't talk on the walk home. No one asked questions, and from that day forward, no one in Pikeville wore a badge again. By spring, the town began to decay. Crops failed entirely. Smoke from the chimneys grew thinner each month as more families packed and left. The remaining few, mostly the old, the stubborn, and the lost, stayed because they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But they stopped calling it Pikeville. They started calling it what the papers once had, the Valley of Death. No one dared to speak the Whitlocks' names. The sisters had become more than women, more than ghosts. They were a presence, something that lingered in the soil, in the mist, in every whispered story that started with, "Don't go near the mountain." The preacher who had once condemned the sisters grew quiet, too. He spent his final sermon speaking only of forgiveness, though no one could tell whether he meant for the sisters or for the people who had hung them. One evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, he rang the chapel bell and vanished. The bell kept swinging long after the rope stopped moving. A year after the sheriff disappeared, the new county coroner, a man named Dr. Albert Brennan, decided to visit the site himself. He was a skeptic, a man of science who dismissed talk of curses and hauntings as the ramblings of frightened country folk. He took with him 2 assistants, a lantern, and his revolver. The trail was nearly gone by then, swallowed by thick roots and moss. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, and yet, despite the chill, sweat ran down their backs, a nervous heat that came from fear, not exertion. By the time they reached the clearing, daylight had almost gone. The cabin was still gone, or perhaps half there. What stood before them looked less like ruins and more like a memory trying to rebuild itself. The outline of walls shimmered faintly, as if made of smoke. The air hummed softly, vibrating in their bones, and from the ground in the center of the clearing came a slow, steady breathing. It wasn't wind. It was the mountain. Dr. Brennan ordered his men to hold their lanterns high. "Take samples," he said. "We'll document everything." But his voice trembled. He stepped toward the place where the trap door had once been, brushing away wet leaves with the toe of his boot. Beneath them, the soil was warm. impossibly warm for spring. When he knelt and pressed his ear to the ground, he froze. There were voices, hundreds of them whispering in unison. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading and singing all at once. He stumbled back. "We're leaving," he said, breathless. "Now!" But before they could move, the humming rose to a deafening pitch. The air thickened, pressing down on their chests until they could hardly breathe. The assistants dropped their lanterns, and the flames went out. Darkness swallowed everything. When the search party went up 2 days later, they found only one man. Brennan. He was sitting at the edge of the clearing, soaked and covered in ash. His hair had turned completely white. When they asked what happened, he wouldn't speak. When they pressed, he only whispered, "It's not done." He spent the rest of his life in an asylum in Lexington, drawing the same pattern over and over on the walls, 3 spirals locked together, the same mark that burned on William Carter's hand. The mark of the sisters. By 1877, Pikeville was nearly abandoned. Only a few dozen families remained, those too poor to leave or too frightened to believe they could ever truly escape. Among them was the town's gravedigger, Samuel Foster, who lived beside the cemetery. He was the first to notice that the earth above the 3 unmarked. Graves never settled. Each morning, he'd pass by with his lantern and see the same thing, the mounds freshly raised, the soil damp as though something beneath it had been breathing. One night, curiosity overcame him. He took his shovel and began to dig. The deeper he went, the colder it got. His breath fogged in the air. The ground below him trembled softly. Then his shovel struck wood. He brushed the dirt away, revealing a coffin lid, still intact, still sealed. But when he pried it open, there was nothing inside. No bones, no cloth. Just 3 black stones arranged in a spiral. He dropped the lid and ran screaming through the cemetery, lantern swinging wildly, his voice echoing into the night. By morning, the graves were gone. In their place were 3 perfect depressions in the earth, shaped as though something had risen. The next storm came 3 nights later, sudden, violent, and unlike any the town had ever seen. Lightning struck the ridge over and over, each flash accompanied by a deep rhythmic sound. Some swore it wasn't thunder. It was singing. 3 voices carried on the wind. The morning after, Pikeville was silent again. But on the mountain, where the Whitlock Hollow once stood, 3 new cairns of black stone had appeared, stacked in perfect symmetry. No one built them, and no one dared to tear them down. By the time the 1880s rolled over the Appalachians, Pikeville had become little more than a memory on fading. Maps, a scattering of empty houses, overgrown paths, and the skeleton of a church whose bell had long gone silent. Only the wind remained constant, whispering through pine and hollow as if repeating a language older than words. But the mountain had not gone silent. It had merely waited. Those who passed through the region spoke of strange things. Campers waking to find their fires cold and rearranged into spirals. Hunters hearing 3 sets of footsteps behind them, always stopping when they turned. And at night, always at night, the faint echo of a melody carried through the fog. A melody in perfect 3-part harmony. Most travelers left quickly, muttering about bad spirits and mountain things best left alone. But not everyone turned away. Some were drawn to it. In the fall of 1886, a mild earthquake shook eastern Kentucky. It was brief, only a few seconds, but enough to rattle windows and crack the earth in strange places. When the townsfolk visited the old cemetery days later, they found something no tremor could explain. The 3 graves, the ones that had refused to stay flat, had collapsed inward. At first they thought it was soil erosion, until they saw what lay beneath. The coffins were gone. There was no wood, no bone, not even the faintest trace of decay. The ground beneath the empty holes was hard and clean, almost polished, as though something had melted the stone itself. The gravedigger, Samuel Foster's brother Daniel, fled town the next day. Before leaving, he told the sheriff of the next county a single sentence that would make its way into the records. They weren't buried. They were waiting. After that, no one spoke the sisters' names again, not in daylight. The years passed, but the mountain didn't forget. Crops still refused to grow on the northern slopes. Hunters who entered the high valley sometimes didn't return. And those who did came back changed, pale, trembling, speaking in whispers. They said the hollow had opened again, that the earth had split where the old Whitlock cabin once stood, revealing the dark mouth of something far older than any human settlement. No one investigated officially. The county called it a sinkhole, and the report was quietly filed away. But locals knew better. The mountain was waking up. One of those locals was Judge Cornelius Hammond, the same man who had sentenced the sisters to hang 13 years earlier. By 1886, he was no longer the commanding figure he'd once been. His hair had thinned to gray, and his hands shook constantly, even at rest. He'd stopped hearing cases years ago. His nights were haunted by whispers, his dreams by that impossible song. He tried to pray, but each time he opened his mouth, his voice faltered. Sometimes he swore he heard another voice pray along with him, mocking him softly in perfect unison. "The mountain remembers, Cornelius. You remember too." He moved to Lexington to escape it. It followed him there. His servants often found him in the middle of the night, standing at the window, murmuring strange phrases under his breath, words in no known language. By 1880, his mind had collapsed under the weight of it. He was sent to a private institution, where he spent his final years scrawling spiral patterns on the walls of his cell until his fingers bled. His last recorded words before dying were whispered to a nurse who didn't understand their meaning but wrote them down anyway. "The mountain remembers. The mountain waits." When word of the judge's death reached Pike County, those few who still lived there took it as an omen. They said the sisters had taken back their executioner, that one by one. Everyone who had touched their fate would follow. And they were right. Because that spring, lightning struck the ruins of the old Pikeville jail. 3 times. Witnesses from nearby farms said the thunder didn't sound like thunder at all. It sounded like laughter. Soon after, the last remaining juror from the Whitlock trial, a man named Jeremiah Hanks, began writing letters to his family in Ohio. The letters started rational, describing bad dreams, odd lights, and the sound of women singing somewhere deep in the hills. But the later ones were worse, filled with half-finished sentences, circles drawn in the margins, and frantic scribbles of the same 6 words. "You can't kill the mountain." The final letter arrived months after Jeremiah had already been found dead in his home, his body slumped in a chair, eyes open, lips curved into a faint smile. The ink on the last line of his letter had never fully dried, as though written moments before his heart stopped. "It's calling me home." By the end of the 19th century, Pikeville was gone. The remaining structures were swallowed by forest, the roads reclaimed by vines. Only the cemetery remained visible, and even that began to sink into the ground. Travelers passing through at night sometimes caught glimpses of something moving among the trees. 3 silhouettes, perfectly still, watching, and if you listened long enough, when the wind was right and the air was cold, you could hear it. That melody, low, ancient, and patient. The same song that had haunted Pikeville since 1873. The same song that had never truly stopped. In time, people forgot the names, forgot the dates, forgot the story of the Whitlock sisters. But the mountain never forgot them, because they were never gone. They were simply part of it now. When a place dies, it doesn't vanish. It sinks into the soil, into memory, into something that breathes between the cracks of time. That's what Pikeville had become, a ghost folded into the mountain's ribs. By the turn of the century, the railroad had come to eastern Kentucky. New towns sprang up, coal mines chewed through the valleys, and people spoke of progress, of light, of engines replacing horses. But even with all that noise and steel, there were places the trains refused to go, places where the engineers claimed their compasses spun wild and the tracks warped overnight. And always those places lay near the old hollow. In 1903, a team of surveyors from Louisville was sent to chart the region for a new rail line. The youngest of them, a man named Henry Avery, was bright, curious, and far too skeptical for his own good. He'd heard the local warnings. "Don't go past the black pines," they said. "Don't follow the singing if you hear it." Henry laughed it off. "Superstition," he told his crew chief. "The only thing that haunts these mountains is ignorance." 3 days later, the crew found his tent empty. His boots were still by the fire. His notebook was open beside them. On the last page, in hurried handwriting, he had written, "I saw them. 3 women, standing where the compass stopped. No one found his body, But they found his footprints, a perfect triangle of 3 sets, side by side leading into the hollow. And only his going, not his coming back. That winter, snow buried the region. Locals said they could still hear singing beneath the storms, soft and far away like a lullaby for the dead. The new railroad was quietly redirected 30 miles east. No one officially explained why. Unofficially, the foreman told a reporter from Lexington, "The mountain told us no." He never elaborated. Meanwhile, in Lexington, the name Whitlock resurfaced for the first time in decades, not in newspapers, but in academia. A young folklorist at the University of Kentucky, Theodore Ashford, stumbled across the sheriff's journal while cataloging old county records. The ink was faded, the handwriting desperate, the pages stained with water and something darker. It fascinated him. The story of 3 sisters erased from history, the missing sheriff, the vanished town. It all sounded like myth, except for one detail. The journal had a map, a rough hand-drawn sketch of the hollow. Against every warning, Ashford decided to go there. He traveled by train to Pike County, then hired a mule and a local guide to take him up into the northern ridges. The guide, an old trapper named Boone Harris, refused to go all the way. "Won't step foot in the Whitlock Hollow," he said. "Ain't no man who does and comes back right." Ashford smiled politely. "I'm not looking for ghosts, Mr. Harris, just history." Boone spat tobacco into the dirt. "That's the same thing up there." He left the professor at the forest's edge and turned back before dusk. Ashford walked the last mile alone. By evening, he found the place, the hollow. At first, it looked like any other clearing, overgrown, quiet, unremarkable. The remains of blackened stone marked where the cabin once stood, but the air was different, still, heavy, as if every sound was being swallowed before it could echo. He unpacked his camera and notebook, documenting everything. The strange symbols etched into the rocks, the unnatural geometry of the trees, bending inward like ribs, the smell of damp iron rising from the soil. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, he decided to stay one night. He pitched a small tent, lit a fire, and began reading the old diary of Sarah Whitlock by lantern light. Her final line sent a shiver through him. They belonged to the mountain. A branch snapped somewhere beyond the firelight. Then another. Ashford froze. "Boone?" he called softly, but the guide was long gone. The air carried a faint hum, low, almost inaudible, vibrating through the ground. It was a sound he recognized instantly. The one described in Blackburn's notes, in Brennan's testimony, in every account since the 1870s. A song. 3 voices. He stood clutching his lantern. "Hello?" he called into the dark. No answer. But the song grew louder. It was beautiful and terrible. Perfect harmony threaded with something mournful, something older than words. And then he saw them. 3 silhouettes standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight, perfectly still, perfectly identical. The wind didn't move their hair. Their dresses didn't flutter. They were carved in the night itself. Ashford's voice trembled. "Who's there?" The figures tilted their heads in unison. One raised a hand, slowly, gracefully, and pointed toward him. The singing stopped, and from the dark came a single whisper. "The mountain remembers you now." Ashford's journals were found months later, packed in a weatherproof box at the base of the mountain. His tent, his gear, and his body were never recovered. The final page of his notes read, "The song comes from below, not from the earth, but from what sleeps inside it." For decades afterward, no one dared to return. Maps redrew the area, renaming the region unnavigable terrain. Locals who lived near the new rail line avoided the northern passes entirely. But every so often, when the fog rolled low and the air turned cold, the people of the new Pike County would hear faint harmonies drifting down from the ridge. 3 voices. Always 3. Some said it was just the wind. Others said it was the past, a memory too stubborn to die. But the mountain knew the truth, because it never forgets what belongs to it, and it was awake again. By the 1920s, the story of Pikeville had almost vanished from Kentucky's memory. The mountain had reclaimed it so completely that only a handful of older families even remembered the name. But that didn't stop people from talking, just more quietly now. The whispers carried through taverns, through train stations, through coal camps that popped up along the hills. They called it the Singing Hollow, and though few could point to where it was, everyone swore it was real. It was the summer of 1924 when a mining company named Cumberland Ironworks began surveying the northern ridge for coal veins. The company didn't care for ghost stories. To them, the mountain wasn't cursed. It was unclaimed, and therefore profitable. The project foreman, Walter Briggs, was a practical man, tall, brash, and proud of his ability to ignore superstition. He'd worked across Appalachia and laughed at every haunted mine he'd ever heard about. But the mountain didn't care what Walter believed. It remembered. The first few weeks of work went smoothly. Teams cut through the underbrush, marking boundaries with orange flags. The geologists took samples, miners pitched tents, and the company promised a whole new town would rise from this quiet valley. But then came the first incident. A mule team hauling timber refused to move past a certain bend in the trail. The animals froze, ears flat, eyes wide, then bolted downhill, dragging their handler into a tree. He broke his neck instantly. The workers buried him at the base of the ridge, marking the grave with a cross made from pick handles. That night, the cross was gone. In its place was a small pile of black stones arranged in a spiral. 2 days later, the drilling began. By noon, the men had bored 30 feet into the rock before the machinery jammed. The foreman cursed, ordered it cleared, and when they pulled the drill back up, the bit was coated in a thick black resin that smelled like iron and smoke. None of the engineers could identify it. It wasn't oil. It wasn't tar. It looked more like blood. They cleaned the machine and kept working. By dusk, they had dug another 6 feet before they hit something else. The drill screeched and stopped again, but this time, when they withdrew the bit, the men stared in disbelief. Wrapped around the metal spiral were 3 long strands of black hair, perfectly straight, perfectly preserved, as if someone had been waiting just below the surface. That night, one of the miners, a man named Lewis Carver, vanished. He'd been seen heading to his tent after dinner. By morning, his bedroll was empty. They searched for 2 days. On the 3rd, they found him, or what was left of him. His body lay at the edge of the creek, face turned upward, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The coroner's report said he had drowned, but the strange part wasn't that. It was the look on his face. Terror, yes, but something else too. Recognition, as if he'd seen something he knew. Something old. By the time the second miner disappeared, most of the workers wanted out. They claimed they heard voices underground when they drilled, soft humming that rose and fell with the rhythm of their hammers. Briggs dismissed it as imagination until he heard it himself. Late one night, as he reviewed maps in his tent, he felt the ground vibrate under his boots. His lantern flickered, and from somewhere deep within the mountain came the faintest trace of song. 3 voices. Perfect harmony. He froze. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then the lantern glass cracked and the flame went out. When he relit it, he saw something new scratched into the inside wall of his tent. 3 spirals, burned into the canvas. The next morning, Briggs ordered the crew to pack up. "We're moving operations east," he said. "Ground's unstable." But the truth was, he didn't want to stay another night. As they left, the wind picked up. It wasn't strong, but it carried that sound again, that low, wordless melody. 3 notes, then silence. When they looked back, mist was rolling down from the ridge, swallowing the clearing where they'd worked. By the time they reached the base of the mountain, it was gone. No tents, no drills, not even footprints. The entire worksite had vanished into the fog. The company wrote it off as a landslide. But when a second team arrived a year later to survey the area, they found no evidence of earth movement. The land was untouched, except for one thing. In the center of the valley, 3 new cairns of black stone had been built, perfectly aligned, perfectly symmetrical. No one claimed responsibility. No one went near them. In the decades that followed, the mountain became a place of whispers again. Campers who strayed too far north vanished without a trace. Hunters came back raving about the women in the fog. And anyone who tried to map the area reported their compasses spinning wildly, every needle pointing toward the same empty clearing, the same hollow. Locals still tell stories, though never after dark. They say that on quiet nights you can hear singing carried on the wind. And if you ever follow the sound, if you ever try to find where it comes from, you'll see them. 3 women, identical, standing shoulder to shoulder among the black stones. And if you look long enough, they'll turn their heads all at once and sing your name. Because the mountain remembers, and once it remembers you, it doesn't let go. By the 1950s, the Whitlock Hollow had faded into a rumor, the kind of half-believed story told in coal, camps, and diner booths after too much whiskey. But the people who lived near the northern ridges of Kentucky still locked their doors early, still refused to build on that slope of the mountain. It wasn't religion anymore. It was survival. In the fall of 1953, a small group of graduate students from the University of Chicago arrived in Pike County. Their goal was simple: document forgotten American folklore. Their leader, Professor Elaine Morrow, had spent a decade collecting oral histories across Appalachia, but she'd never heard anything like the Whitlock tale. The surviving locals warned her not to go looking. "You'll find them if you do," an old miner told her. "But they won't let you leave." She smiled politely, thanked him for his time, and wrote the quote in her field journal under the heading, "Superstitions of Pike County." 2 weeks later, she led her team of 3 into the hollow. They never came back. The search party that followed found their abandoned Jeep at the base of the ridge. The tires were intact, the headlights still on. In the back seat sat Morrow's leather field bag, her journals, and an old tape recorder. The recorder was still running. What it captured would haunt the investigators for decades. At first, there was wind, slow, steady, moving through leaves. Then came Morrow's voice, calm, professional. "We're near the old clearing now. Symbols visible on the stones, possibly pre-Christian in origin." There was a pause. Then faintly someone whispered, "Do you hear that?" The audio grew distorted. A low vibration filled the tape, almost like breathing. And then, clear as daylight, 3 voices humming in perfect harmony. The sound rose and fell like a lullaby, soft and sorrowful, layered with something too complex to be human. One of the students muttered a prayer. Another said, "It's coming from under us." Morrow whispered, "Keep recording." There was movement, the crunch of boots, the hiss of wind. Then, without warning, a scream. A single, sharp, blood-freezing sound. The recorder fell. The song swelled until it drowned everything. The tape ended there. The FBI took the equipment. The report was sealed. The official statement said the students were lost in severe weather, but the locals knew better. They said the mountain had called them. By the 1970s, the legend had evolved again. Now truckers driving the coal, highways at night told stories about seeing figures in the fog along Route 80, 3 women walking hand in hand, barefoot, their faces pale and blank. They'd appear in the headlights for an instant, then vanish. And always, the radio would cut out right before it happened. One driver, Cliff Nolan, swore he'd nearly hit them. He slammed his brakes, jumped out of the cab, but the road was empty. When he climbed back in, he found his radio still hissing. The signal cleared just long, enough for him to hear a voice whisper, through the static, "You can't kill the mountain." He quit the job the next day and left Kentucky for good. The locals called these stories nonsense. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Because each time someone went missing near the old ridge, the same pattern appeared. 3 spirals carved into the nearest tree, perfectly symmetrical. In 1981, a park ranger named Harold Green was assigned to survey the area for a proposed nature reserve. He was a pragmatic man, ex-military, fond of structure, allergic to superstition. But the night he camped near the hollow, he stopped being a skeptic. He'd gone to sleep near his fire, journal open beside him. Sometime after midnight, he woke to what he thought was the sound of rain. But when he stepped out of his tent, he realized it wasn't rain. It was singing. Distant but clear, weaving through the trees. 3 voices, one low, one middle, one high, blending in a way that made his stomach twist. He called out, flashlight scanning the fog. Nothing. Then the beam caught something ahead. Movement, just beyond the tree line. 3 figures. He froze. They were facing away, their long hair clinging to their backs. Their dresses old and gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The 3 figures turned at once. Their faces were identical. Their eyes were black. The flashlight flickered and died. When it came back on, they were gone. The next morning, Green stumbled into the ranger station, pale and trembling. He refused to return to the hollow. He never spoke of what he saw again, except once and to his wife, weeks before he disappeared. She said he woke one night muttering the same phrase over and over, in a voice that wasn't his own. "It's awake now. It remembers us all." He vanished the next morning. His truck was found by the river, door open, engine running, radio tuned to static, and carved into the mud beside the tire tracks were 3 perfect spirals. By the 1990s, locals had stopped going near the ridge altogether. The government fenced it off, citing unstable terrain and subsidence hazards. But no one believed that. They believed something else entirely, something their grandparents had always whispered when the fog rolled down the slopes. "The sisters are walking again." There are places in America that never made it to the maps, not because they were forgotten, but because someone made sure they stayed forgotten. The Whitlock Hollow is one of them. By the early 2000s, it existed only in rumor, a story traded on internet forums, shared in grainy photos and half-remembered threads under titles like the Appalachian Triplets or the Sisters Who Sing. Most people dismissed it as backwoods folklore. But one man, a documentary filmmaker from Ohio, named Daniel Rowe, decided to prove it was real. And that decision cost him everything. Daniel was obsessed with lost Americana, the legends that lived between history and horror. He'd filmed ghost towns in Nevada, vanished mines in Montana, and flooded cemeteries in Mississippi. When he found references to 3 sisters executed in Kentucky in 1873, he thought he'd struck gold. The deeper he dug, the stranger it became. The town records from Pikeville had gaps. The court transcripts from that year were missing. Even the local library's archives, which should have held the sheriff's journals, had been quietly transferred decades earlier and never returned. Someone had scrubbed the story clean. So Daniel decided to find the truth himself. He recruited 2 friends, sound engineer Mason Ward and producer Tessa James, and drove to Pike County in the fall of 2003. Their goal, film a short documentary titled The Witches of Whitlock Hollow. They were warned. Every local they spoke to told them not to go past the old fire road. One gas station clerk said it best. "If you hear 'em sing, don't listen. They don't want you to hear. They want you to follow." Daniel laughed. "Perfect quote," he said, jotting it down in his notebook. On October 12th, the team set up camp near the ridge. Daniel filmed his opening monologue under a gray, rolling sky. "We're standing at the edge of one of America's most mysterious places on a site erased from official history. Locals say it's cursed, haunted by 3 sisters who were too evil for the history books." Behind him, the wind whispered through the trees. The audio caught something faint, 3 soft notes, almost like humming. Mason noticed it during playback. "Probably wind," Daniel said. But Mason didn't agree. "The wind doesn't harmonize." That night, the crew sat around the fire reviewing footage. Every clip recorded near the hollow had the same strange distortion, a background hum that rose and fell like a heartbeat. Tessa grew uneasy. "Let's leave tomorrow," she said. "We've got enough for a teaser." Daniel smiled. "We came for the truth." "Tessa, if there's something here, we're not leaving without it." He turned his camera toward the forest, hit record, and whispered, "If anyone's out there, sing for us." The woods were silent. Then came a sound, a faint at first, then closer. 3 voices drifting through the trees, the same melody the students had captured 50 years before. The footage recovered later would show what happened next, though no one can explain it. At first, Daniel walked toward the sound, camera still rolling. The others followed, calling after him. Then the light flared, a blinding flash of white that filled the frame. The camera shook violently, and for a single frame, 3 figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, identical, still, watching, then static. The recording continued for nearly 6 hours after that, capturing nothing but fog, the faint echo of footsteps, and finally on a low rhythmic hum, the same 3-note melody, looping endlessly until the battery died. The search team found their campsite 3 days later. The tents were intact. Food was untouched. But Daniel, Mason, and Tessa were gone. The only clue was the camera, half buried in the dirt near the stream, and 3 spirals carved into the mud beside it. When investigators reviewed the footage, they found something strange. The timestamp on the final frame didn't match. It wasn't from 2003. It read October 23, 1873, the day of the Whitlock Sisters' execution. The footage was quietly confiscated. The report classified as lost during processing, but copies have circulated online ever since. Fragments, shaky and grainy, uploaded under different names. Each time, the audio is the same, a woman's voice whispering over the hum. "You can't kill the mountain." In 2018, hikers near the Pike County border posted a video that went viral for 48 hours before it vanished. It showed fog rolling through the valley, sunlight cutting across the hills. Then the camera panned, and for less than a second, 3 figures stood in the mist, side by side. The audio glitched. The hiker's voice said, "What the hell is that?" Then faintly, laughter. 3 voices. When he uploaded it, he added a caption that simply read, "They were waiting for me." He deleted his account 2 days later. No one's heard from him since. Today, Pike County warns travelers not to venture north of the state forest after dark. The government calls it an environmental hazard zone, but the people who live nearby know better. They say sometimes, when the fog settles low and the air tastes like iron, you can hear music drifting from the ridge. 3 voices, always 3, calling softly, patiently, waiting for someone new to remember them. Because that's the thing about the mountain. You can bury it in history. You can silence its name, but the mountain doesn't forget. And what belongs to it always comes back. There are places that hold memories like living things, that breathe, that wait, that hunger. The Appalachian Mountains are one of them, and deep in those folds of mist and stone, something ancient still remembers its children. By 2023, the story of the Whitlock Sisters had been buried under more than a century of silence. But nothing stays buried forever, not in those hills. It began again the way all Appalachian legends do, with a whisper. A new highway project, Route 119, north expansion, cut straight toward the old restricted zone. When the first bulldozers arrived, the locals protested quietly. "This ain't just land," an old woman told the county surveyor. "It's a grave that doesn't stay closed." They laughed her off. 3 weeks later, the machines stopped working. Every sensor failed. Every GPS reading turned to zeros. And every camera mounted on the rigs showed the same thing when reviewed later. A fog moving against the wind. On the morning of June 12th, the foreman, Rick Donahue, went missing. He'd radioed from the work site just after sunrise. "Something's wrong with the ground," he said. "Feels like it's breathing." Those were his last words. They found his hard hat by the river 2 days later. Inside, it was a small, perfect spiral burned into the plastic. The site was abandoned. The project canceled. 2 months later, a local journalist named Clara started investigating. She was a Kentucky native, tough, skeptical, and hungry for a story. She'd heard the rumors all her life. The 3 women in the fog, the cursed hollow, the mountain that remembers. But she wanted proof. She tracked down the few surviving documents that hadn't been destroyed. An incomplete sheriff's journal from 1873, a faded map labeled Whitlock Hollow, and a single audio recording marked Pike County, 1953, Tape 3. The tape was warped, but one section was clear. A woman's voice whispering through static. "They belong to the mountain." That was enough. Claire packed her recorder, flashlight, and camera and drove north into the mountains one October afternoon. She left her car at the last service road and hiked the rest of the way on foot. She recorded her notes as she went. "I'm about 2 miles north of the old fire line. Heavy mist rolling in. Air feels thick, metallic. There's a clearing ahead and could be where the cabin once stood. No sound of birds or insects. It's too quiet. The last entry on the tape is calm, almost serene. I think I see something. 3 stones in a circle. Looks like markers. I'll go closer. Wait, it's humming. The grounds!" And then the recording stops. When rescuers found her camera 2 days later, it was lying beside her abandoned backpack. The footage shows fog creeping through the clearing. Thick, silvery, alive. Claire steps into frame. She kneels, brushing away leaves to reveal 3 black stones arranged in a perfect triangle. Then, from behind her, 3 figures appear. Pale, motionless, identical. She turns, gasps, and the video cuts to static. The final frame lingers just long enough to show something carved into the nearest rock. "The mountain remembers." The footage leaked online for one night before being removed from every platform. No one knows who uploaded it, but mirrors of the file still circulate under different names. The Pikeville tape. 3 voices in the fog. The sisters who never died. If you listen closely to the background hum, you can still hear faint singing beneath the static, a harmony so perfect it feels wrong. And in the very last second, just before the clip ends, a woman's voice whispers directly into the microphone. "We never left. Locals say the fog hasn't lifted from the ridge since. They say even in the hottest months, when the valley bakes in sunlight, that stretch of forest stays cold. Some nights the mist moves like breath, slow, steady, as if something enormous sleeps beneath the roots. They say animals avoid the place, that hunters who enter never return, that hikers wake in the dark to find 3 footprints circling their tents, always 3. Historians, journalists, and ghost hunters have all tried to explain it. Mass hysteria, gas leaks, weather phenomena, magnetic anomalies. But those who've lived long enough to remember what their grandparents whispered don't bother with science anymore. They just close their windows when the fog comes down and pray they don't hear the song. Because if you hear it, if you truly hear it, it's already too late. They say the mountain is alive, that every name, every face, every soul it's ever taken still breathes through the stone. That the Whitlock sisters were never the beginning, only the first to wear its voice. And that sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can still hear them standing in the mist, their pale faces turned toward the valley, singing to anyone foolish enough to listen. 3 voices, always 3. Perfect, eternal, waiting. Because you can kill a family, you can burn a house, you can bury a town, but you can't kill the mountain. It remembers, it waits, it always returns. And if you ever find yourself driving through the fog in Pike County, and the radio cuts to static, and you hear 3 voices singing in harmony, don't stop.